The UK government wreaks havoc with yet more sudden changes on COVID policy. Dr. Anthony Fauci's emails become the latest topic of furious partisan battles in the US, and China's Xi Jinping decides that the country needs to be more lovable. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. So, you can go on holiday to Portugal, you know. You're gonna go? Think of it! Beautiful Portugal! You're in? You've booked it? Wait, here it comes! The UK government continues with its obsessive tweaking and micromanaging. It's now it's on, now it's off style of crushing people's hopes and dreams. And this week the focus has been on will they or won't they? June the 21st is the big promised Freedom Day, when the majority of the remaining restrictions get released. But the government and the scientists and the media can't help themselves but constantly speculate, constantly hold up the spectre of possible defeat. Boris Johnson said that he was considering delaying the reopening by a fortnight, even though the data shows nothing right now to suggest that would be necessary. To drive the point home, Professor Ravi Gupta of Cambridge University has been doing the media rounds. A member of the government's nerve tag committee, he's been predicting doom and disaster if we go ahead with opening up. There's been an exponential growth in the number of new cases, and at least 3/4 of them are the new variant, he told BBC's Today programme. Of course, the numbers of cases are still relatively low at the moment, but all waves start with low numbers of cases that rumble in the background and then become explosive. He went on to suggest that all this vaccinating might lead to people having a false sense of security. Because heaven forbid that people shouldn't be scared out of their minds. But the point is that the UK will have by then had all of its relatively vulnerable people. They will have at least been offered the jab. The vast majority will have had both jabs plus a couple of weeks. If you can't open at that point, people will ask what was the point of getting vaccinated in the first place. And I mean, seriously, it's going to be some time before the whole world has caught up. So what on earth is the new strategy, if not to vaccinate all the people and then let them out to reclaim their lives? And of course, a number of the scientists are saying just that, because it's exactly how this was always supposed to work. So Professor Robert Reid, who sits on the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, said that he didn't agree with Gupta. You have to remember that if you've got all of your over 50-year-olds vaccinated, the likelihood there would be a catastrophic effect on health, and in particular on the NHS in this country, is pretty small. And that's the point. The fearmongers are saying that there's a new variant, the Indian variant, except we're not allowed to call it that anymore. It's the Delta variant or something. Maybe, just maybe, that variant will prove to be completely immune to our vaccines. It will blast through our population like a knife through butter. Except so far none of the variants have done that, and early indications are that this one doesn't either. But it's Gupta's voice that the media decides to amplify, presumably because those sorts of messages get more clicks. And so you have tens of thousands of small businesses looking to finally open up to full capacity in a couple of weeks, having been taken right to the precipice, having had previous openings introduced, and just as soon as they bought all the perishable stock that they needed, yep. And people are saying, well, maybe we should just delay another couple of weeks, just to be safe. And this is what happens when the government, the media, and by extension the majority of the population end up fixated on just one variable in a complex problem. There doesn't seem to be a set vision at the centre for how the UK comes out of all of this. The fear is that, we're going to open up, but we're going to just stay poised to slam that door shut again as soon as there's the faintest news of a scary new variant, at which point you will simply lose a good proportion of those businesses that managed just about to survive so far. Even those countries that have done best on all of this have found that the solutions are not so easy to stick. The Fortress Australia policy came into question again this week as another outbreak led to an extension of an ongoing Melbourne lockdown. Part of the problem is that while Australia has been enjoying a higher quality of life than most of the rest of us, behind its closed border, it hasn't been able to move very fast with its vaccination programme. which, unless you can keep the virus at bay indefinitely and you're able to keep your country sealed off from the rest of the world likewise, sooner or later it's going to become a real problem. So far, the policy has achieved high levels of approval. 95% of the Australian public believe the government has generally handled the pandemic well, according to a Lowy Institute poll. But at the same time, Australia has prided itself in the past in being an open trading nation committed to globalisation and the marketplace. Those attitudes are now being tested by the increasing sense that safety and security comes from being locked off from the world. And since life is relatively normal, there's been little sense of urgency behind that vaccination programme. A recent report by the Mallen Institute says that Australia's current vaccination rate would see a closed border for at least another 3 months, at a cost to the economy of over 16 billion Australian dollars. And as Taiwan has discovered in the last couple of weeks, you shouldn't assume that those months are necessarily going to be spent in happy, carefree separation from COVID-19. Meanwhile, the EU is starting to roll out its digital vaccine passports programme. 7 countries are now using the COVID travel pass, which permits vaccinated citizens to travel freely. Germany, Denmark, Poland, Greece, Bulgaria, Czechia and Croatia. The system will give you a pass if you've been vaccinated, but also if you've had the virus in the recent past or if you've had a negative test result. We've arguably reached that point where many who dislike the whole idea of a vaccine pass in principle are now shrugging their shoulders and getting on with it. Anything to escape this constant changing landscape of who can travel where and on what basis. Now, in a minute, we'll look at the fuss over Dr. Fauci's emails and more of the week's news. But first, you may be aware that one Steve Koonin recently released a book called Unsettled, taking a jab at some of the messages we currently get on climate change. Well, this week he was sent the latest broadside in response. A group of no fewer than a dozen climate scientists, including high-profile activist scientists such as Michael Mann and Naomi Oreskes, penned a piece for Scientific American, and it finished by calling Koonin a crank who's only taken seriously by far-right disinformation peddlers hungry for anything they can use to score political points. He's just another denier trying to sell a book. Now, there's a debate to be had, no doubt, about some of the messages, the claims that Koonin has put in his book and how well supported they are or are not by the science. But name-calling? Really? Scientists going into the pages of Scientific American to carry out ad hominem attacks on people? And my understanding is, secondhand, but my understanding is that Koonin has been denied the right to reply by Scientific American. So this isn't just in the category of a spirited debate. As you know, I'm of the belief that people's ideas should be evaluated in isolation from what you think of them as people. So what are the claims being made by Koonin that got people so hot under the collar? Do the claims or their criticisms stand up best under scrutiny? And what does this latest instance tell us about the changing nature of public policy discourse where it involves the scientific community? Sounds like something we should talk about, so that's what I will be looking at in the video to go live on this channel at 7 PM UK time on Monday. Join me then. There was a flurry of excitement among some this week when a huge cache of the emails of Dr. Anthony Fauci were released following a Freedom of Information request. Unless there's a truly startling revelation, something no one saw coming, these sorts of releases tend to be a bit like the Rorschach ink blot. What you see in them says more about your previous beliefs than they do about the actual source of the emails. And arguably so it was here. Liberals, for whom Fauci is an unblemished hero, saw all the signs of how he has been working tirelessly to cope with a chaotic unfolding situation. Conservatives, some of whom have a significantly poorer view of Fauci, scoured the emails and came up with half a dozen that they swore were shocking and should see him summarily fired. I'm generally wary of such narratives because it's very easy to comb through a large number of emails, find a few comments or phrases that can be taken out of context. If you end up debating the meaning of certain words or lines in a handful of emails out of a cache of many thousands, it's generally an indicator this is really a fishing expedition in very sparse waters. The point is, these weren't leaked emails. This was an official release. Anything of serious question is going to have been redacted. So a couple of people raised the lab leak hypothesis early on. What Fauci actually thought about it? Redacted. The fact that somebody says something to you doesn't prove anything. I mean, lots of people were saying lots of things, much of it to be ignored. One thing I was quite interested to see, the head of the EcoHealth Alliance, Peter Daszak, the man who has been most involved with projects partnering with the Wuhan lab and most vocally insistent there could not have been a lab leak, he sent an email to Fauci. The purpose of the email was to thank Fauci for saying that he'd ruled the lab leak out. Various people read significance into that. The thing I noticed with interest was that it wasn't in the tone of voice of people who knew each other well offline and had collaborated directly on the projects in principle. And we hadn't known that before. There were some open questions for me with Fauci's involvement in the overall questions around gain-of-function research, Daszak's work very close to the orbit of where that research was being carried out. The substance of the emails actually did not suggest that they had overlapped very much. As the PI of the ROI grant publicly targeted by Fox News reporters at the presidential press briefing last night, I just wanted to say a personal thank you on behalf of our staff and collaborators for publicly standing up and stating that the scientific evidence supports a natural origin for COVID-19 from a bat to human spillover, not a lab release from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Then the next paragraph of Daszak's email is redacted. The grounds of that redaction hints that the content could become legally significant, but we're left guessing about exactly what or why. And he finishes by saying this: once this pandemic's over, I look forward to thanking you in person and let you know how important your comments are to us all. Fauci's reply: many thanks for your kind note. And that comes over as a polite brush off. In spite of what some would like to believe, I don't see a game changer in any of this. Whether Dr. Fauci has a case to answer or not relating to his work and his statements during the pandemic, that's an open question. This email cache does not advance knowledge much on the subject at all. And certainly nothing to dent his popularity with those who are predisposed positively towards him. One person who would be happy to have Fauci's popularity with at least half the population in the world is China's Xi Jinping. This week he told a session of the Communist Party's political bureau that the country needed to become more sophisticated in its strategic communications to become more lovable on the world stage. He said this: the world must learn that the Communist Party is truly striving for the well-being of the Chinese people and understand why Marxism works and why socialism with Chinese characteristics is good. This might be a tacit admission of the missteps the country's propaganda exercise has made in the last couple of years. But it's not the Chinese way to lose face by openly admitting such a thing. Instead, President Xi boasted, "We've effectively guided global opinion and conducted struggles in global opinion. We've noticeably raised our voice and boosted our influence." That influence was also partly boosted, of course, by vaccine diplomacy. China jumping in to supply vaccines to countries while others were focusing on vaccinating their own people, which was a clever move. Except that the Chinese vaccines turned out to have been less effective than originally thought. Chile vaccinated fast and early with Sinovac. Hungary did the same with Sinopharm. Both countries have been hit hard by new waves of hospitalizations and deaths. Turkey's President Erdogan was reported this week to have had a third jab, having already had 2 of the Sinovac vaccine. So that reality, of course, then slightly undermines everything that vaccine diplomacy was meant to achieve. The other announcement this week from China, that it is relaxing its 2-child policy, suggests that the would-be economic powerhouse of the 21st century is having some real problems. According to Capital Economics, the ageing China demographic may prevent China from catching up with the US for decades to come, partly depending on how strong the US manages to be post-pandemic, of course. It said that the Chinese workforce peaked in 2017 and is already shrinking. The company's chief Asia economist, Mark Williams, told the UK's Telegraph, "If China doesn't overtake the US by the mid-2030s, it probably never will. And if it does overtake, it may struggle to hold on to first place." And the fact is, this isn't likely to be helped by Xi Jinping, who has clamped down on those arguing for more political pluralism. And in spite of his desire to be lovable, is tightening down with state-owned corporations leading the way, private entrepreneurs like Jack Ma being humbled before the power of the state. China escaped the poverty of communism when Deng Xiaoping took over from Mao and moved to a market-based economy, even while keeping the language of communism. His son, Deng Pufang, has said China has forgotten those lessons and predicts serious consequences. Well, the next few years are going to be interesting indeed. You should take nothing for granted. Finally, a new study in the journal Nature Climate Change suggests that clouds have a greater cooling effect on the planet than the new generation of climate models currently suggest. The latest generation of models, the CMIP6 generation, which tries to model the effect of clouds more realistically, had been generally seen to be running more hot than the previous generation of models. This paper suggests that those models simulate too much rainfall from clouds and therefore underestimate their lifespan and therefore their cooling effect. If you fix this problem, then the warming effect predicted by the models falls much more in line with that was seen in the previous generation of models. The lead author of the study, Dr. Johann Mulmenstadt, said this: so the main message is take the extra warming in CMIP6 with a grain of salt until some of the other known cloud problems are also fixed in the models. Hopefully someone will remember to tell The Guardian. Now, in a minute, we'll get to responding to comments and the final thought for the week. But first, it's time for another live stream. What will the topic issues be that we can dive straight into with an immediate reaction? Will Mallen finally manage a live stream without grappling with the technology as haplessly as Joe Biden grapples with his teleprompter? Come on, man! Only one way to find out. I'll be looking to share some thoughts about the issues of the moment and open to answering your questions live via the chat. Join me then, going live at 7 p.m. UK time, Wednesday next week. I had a question on last week's video. Question to Mallen: how can the advert-driven mainstream/commercial media be persuaded to improve their game? That's a difficult one because, as you hint in your own question, it's kind of built into their business model. Advertising drives revenue. Playing up partisanship or fear porn leads to the most views and the most clicks, and so pleases the most advertisers. It can reach a point where it's become so transparent, so relentless, that you do at least create the market opportunity for a competitor who sells by restoring integrity to the process. So in the UK, that may be about to happen in the form of Andrew Neil's GB News. It's hard to make a new channel succeed, but people have become so disenchanted with the BBC, amongst other things, with its increasing obsession with woke causes. They certainly have the opportunity if they can get the balance right. In the UK, we are used to the idea that our channels should be impartial, and I think there remains a huge appetite for that. The threat of such competition for people selling to that market might well be the thing that encourages the others to sharpen up their act. Now, in the UK, it's different. There's arguably a saturation of channels already, a more openly politically polarised landscape. The partisan divide is embraced by a wider spread of the population, but the polls do suggest that there's a bunch of people in the middle. And if the US is to regain its sense of itself as a nation, rather than simply as two competing tribes, you would say that was an important group. Does that make space for a determinedly high-quality, non-partisan channel to come in and compete? Maybe. You would probably need some entrepreneur with very deep pockets and a passion for the mission to make it happen. And the trouble is, right now, such entrepreneurs seem to be as deeply vested in the partisan divide as anyone else is. And look, it would be nice if you could say, well, that means that social media channels are the future. But the successful social media creators, including many I watch myself and enjoy, generally become successful by catering explicitly to their side in that partisan divide. And they do that because it works in this context too. So we just have to keep making the attempt to popularise the alternative. Now, I had a good challenge on the video comparing our response to COVID-19 with our very different handling of the 1957 Asian flu. One key part from a longer comment. You ignored the fact that the COVID-19 response has been quite similar across the globe, so you cannot fully attribute the response to the fact that we are not used to pandemics anymore. I am sure the people in the third world have a different attitudes towards life and fate, and that's a fair point, worth thinking about what's actually happening here. So, as I noted in the video, and as this commenter also reinforced earlier in his comment, the impacts on hospitals of COVID-19 is higher than was the case for Asian flu because patients stay longer. And he pointed out that that's the case even with modern flu cases, not just the historical 1957 one. And of course that's a challenge, particularly in developing countries. The UK could have taken a 1957 approach and simply filled its Nightingale hospitals with patients that in the event actually stayed empty. It's not a flexibility they've had in India, which is why there's been such a catastrophic impact there from their second wave. But also you have to bear in mind that in such situations there's the contagion of the virus, but there's also the contagion of ideas about what to do about it. Authoritarian China was the first to get it, dealt with it the way that authoritarians can, and almost nobody else had. Then Italy, which got hit hard and early, did the same, and then people in democracies suddenly revised what they felt they could do. And quickly it became the norm across the world. People did what everyone else was doing. And that applied to a number of those developing countries as well. India did it the first time and then was extremely reluctant to do it again because the process had been so disastrous for many of the people living in poverty with no infrastructure of support. What would have happened in 2020 if Britain had been the origin of the virus? Or Sweden or Taiwan? Who knows how we would have acted? Who knows what then would have become the world norm for how others followed? Would it have been different? I think it probably would have been. Would it have been for the better? Well, we have no idea. The history of 1957 is suggestive, but for lots of reasons, including the ones that the commenter highlighted, but also my core observation that we live in a transformed world and how risk-averse we've become, it would never have looked like a rerun of 1957. In Scotland this week, a feminist campaigner, Marion Miller, has been charged with malicious communication after posting supposedly transphobic messages on Twitter. This is, by the way, even before Scotland's controversial hate crime bill becomes law, for which it was promised that individuals who simply stated their belief would not be criminalised even if it was offensive to some. Now at this point, we don't even know what the tweets were that are deemed to have been criminal. And since we don't know that, presumably they're still on Twitter. All of this is chilling if you care about free speech, which of course you should. It's amazing what can count as offensive these days. So the statement that the dictionary definition of a woman is that of a biological female, that can be upsetting to some people. And then, of course, people say, that's ridiculous, it's just a scientific fact. But, actually, look, I get it. It's entirely possible to say something that is factually true in a way that is nevertheless offensive and upsetting. Let's say I have a friend who has an extremely big nose. And like anyone in that situation, might be a bit sensitive about it. It is, of course, only telling the truth if I refer to him in public as my friend with a big nose, or just shortened to big nose over there. So what's wrong with that? I'm just describing objective reality, no one can dispute it. And it should be the case that doing so is never considered to be illegal, never defined as malicious communication. But people who observed that behaviour will conclude that I'm probably a bit of a jerk for focusing on it. Maybe they'd keep their distance from me as a result, actions have consequences. But then suppose my friend becomes the ruler of the country, and suppose all the social media companies and the police and the rest begin to crack down on anyone making observations about my friend's huge snoz. And a law is passed that the whole country has to actively state that they see a normal-sized nose, and that indeed my friend is the most classically good-looking leader they've ever seen.
Possibly you'll find it just a trifle large.
No, small, very small, tiny, infinitesimal.
At that point, it almost becomes a point of civic duty to say, look at the nose on that. Well, what changed? The element of coercion is a key part of the context. People making public statements that men can't be women are saying something that is true, that is unnecessary to just throw in the face of a transgender person who is only living their life and wanting to present as the kind of person that they want to be. But the context is that there are aggressive campaigners seeking to criminalise biological reality. And they are backed up increasingly by social media companies, and now it seems even the police and the law, at least in Scotland. At that point, whether the people making the statements are doing so because they're heroes or whether because they're jerks should not matter. With a pandemic, with gender, and yes, also with climate change, we've developed an extremely bad habit of enforcing an orthodoxy. And so long as that's the case, it's hard to tell the truth with discretion and with compassion. But it is our duty to tell it nonetheless. Sorry. Big nose.
What?
All right. YouTube commenter Kim Iverson got a strike on her channel last week because of a video where she was talking about ivermectin. Now, as I mentioned in my own video on that topic, it's mentioned by name in the YouTube community guidelines, although it does then have a couple of ill-defined exception clauses. So you end up with this ambiguity. Now, Kim Iverson won't even say the word ivermectin in case it gets her into trouble. Meanwhile, you have Brett Weinstein on his channel with some fairly bold videos discussing it full on. When they don't tell you the rules, the temptation is always to self-censor. You have to have the attitude you don't care about the kickback in order to get that out of that mindset. And that, of course, is what I'm trying to do here. So as always, I'm massively grateful to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Thanks to you, I'm able to put in the time to produce 3 videos per week at all, but also particularly to focus on the topics that matter, regardless of fears of how Big Brother tech companies may view them. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.